Hello, Marcus Bronzy here. Now, Star Trek is generally considered a traditionally episodic franchise. That's what worked for television then. Binge watching and streaming was well, it wasn't around until relatively recently. By making Star Trek so you could miss an episode without being totally out of the loop worked in its favour. In fact, I think that's why it still makes great rerun material on television. You can dip in and you can dip out. Still, the writers and producers were able to sneak continuing arcs and subplots into the various spin-offs and series with greater frequency. And as the franchise aged, well, we kind of got to an era where we got things like the 10-hour movie style structure of Star Trek Picard. Alongside that, we can point to the Klingon Civil War, the Dominion War, and the Red Angel storyline in Discovery as successful ongoing plots. But there are a few subplots and arcs that Star Trek has either failed to deliver on or outright forgotten or mercilessly jettisoned. So here is a dozen Star Trek subplots that boldly went nowhere. Number 12, Wharf and Troy. The romance between Star Trek The Next Generation's Lieutenant Worf and Counselor Troy was a major plot point in TNG's final season. In the episodes Parallels and Eye of the Beholder and All Good Things, the flirtation was juicy and it dated back as far as season 5. Now, when the writers saw that Worf and Troy pairing kind of worked in the episode Ethics, I think that's where they went, you know what, let's go for it. Now, what followed were an alternate timeline marriage and a hallucinatory hookup before the two finally made it official. And in the series finale, which also diverted into an alternate timeline in which Troy was dead and Worf never got over his loved one. Oh, you know what, Worf, you're a big softie, ain't ya? But whilst the series finale of TNG began with an almost kiss, the next time the audiences saw Worf and Troy in Star Trek Generations, the two about-to-be former Enterprise D officers had apparently split up off-screen in the intervening months. But by the time of Worf's arrival on Star Trek Deep Space Nine and his eventual marriage to Lieutenant Jadzia Dax a couple of years later, the Worf-Troy thing wasn't really mentioned. Star Trek Insurrection featured a subtle nod to the pairing when Troy finally reignited her fling with Riker, and Worf grudgingly observed that they'd always had feelings for one another. But calling that an acknowledgement, well, that's kind of a stretch. Number 11, the ESBs. The setting itself was promising, a derelict Borg cube under the command of a shattered Romulan state full of former drones or ESBs, including our own favourite, Hugh. I love that Borgie. Sadly, much of that promise was ancillary to the plot, and whilst Star Trek Picard centred around Picard, a former drone, and also featured 7 of 9, the most famous Borg of all, ex-Borg of all, and still my crush, the ESBs themselves didn't really seem to have much to do with the first season. Even after 7 led the ESBs in a mini revolt against Narissa and the Romulans, they kind of disappeared. Before the end of the season, really, and apparently they crashed on Coppelius, but who knows? Deleted scenes apparently depicted the ESBs going on to live a life of peace with Sung and his hippie android children, but those scenes and any reference to them were sadly omitted from the episode as aired. Number 10, the Phage. The Vedians were positioned early on to be Star Trek Voyager's main antagonists in the Delta Quadrant. The Vedians were disgusting, devious, and hell-bent on stealing the organs of the innocent Starship crews to save themselves from the Phage, the deadly disease. Now, the Vedians weren't just evil, they were multifaceted. Occasionally, we even felt sympathy for them. Even the Doctor fell in love with the Vedian doctor, Danara, in the episode Life Science. But unlike the Kazon, whose story arc gradually built and was fully resolved by the end of Voyager's second season, the Vedians, well, they never really got the compelling story or climax they deserved. Number 9, the Klingons are coming. After being omitted from the final cut of Star Trek 2009, the Klingons finally made their Kelvin timeline debut in J.J. Abrams' follow-up Star Trek Into Darkness. Not only did the Klingons make their debut in Into Darkness, a conflict with the warrior race was explicitly teased by the film by the fear-mongering Admiral Marcus. You know what? Marcus, Admiral, I mean, he's a good Admiral, yeah, I'm being biased because he's got the name Marcus. I kind of liked him a little bit more than I should have. Anyway, according to Marcus, the war with the Klingons was inevitable. The film, not so subtly, left the impression that the Klingons would be coming for revenge. And Star Trek Beyond went on to feature 0 Klingons, even with a cameo appearance on the planet Al-Tamid cut before shooting. So this major conflict with the Klingons that was hinted at in Star Trek Into Darkness ultimately went unmentioned and unfulfilled in Star Trek Beyond, and with no future in the Kelvin timelines in sight, it would appear that Admiral Marcus, I like you Admiral Marcus, well, it wasn't going to be so inevitable, this war that he was going on about, really, was it? Number 8, Sela. Denise Crosby's half-Romulan, all-sideburns antagonist never really got the send-off she truly deserved. Yes, Sela was the mastermind of the Klingon Civil War as hinted at in The Mind's Eye and ultimately dramatised in the Redemption arc. But Sela's true story began a season prior in yesterday's Enterprise when her mother travelled back in time and was captured by the Romulans. We learned of Tasha's fate and the origin of Sela in Redemption, but the character's past and her connection to the crew of the USS Enterprise D, well, that was never really fully explored. Sela represented a huge story potential that was bafflingly forgotten by the producers. Number 7, Thomasreicher. Whilst Thomasreicher could have been relegated to a single appearance in Star Trek The Next Generation's Second Chances, the producers rightly saw that he was a good fit for Star Trek Deep Space Nine's rough around the edges tone and brought Riker back for Defiant. Defiant continued Tom's arc established in TNG, showing him chafing against his role as the second Riker and hooking up with a band of Marquis for a suicide mission to destroy a secret Obsidian order fleet. The episode concluded with Tom being hauled off to a Cardassian prison, but with a kiss and a promise from Major Kira that they would meet again. And, well, they never did. And Thomasreicher presumably spent the rest of DS9 in a Cardassian labour camp. It's still not clear why DS9 chose not to follow up on this own explicit promise to rescue the character, but Thomasreicher was included in the internal materials from the producers as a topic the writers were absolutely not interested in revisiting. Apparently, the Star Trek universe just wasn't for a double portion of the Riker lean. Number 6, the warp speed limit. Star Trek The Next Generation's episode Force of Nature was a forgettable but well-intentioned effort by the writing staff to tackle an ecological issue to end the story with lasting consequences. Now, the 7th season episode revealed that warp drive was threatening the very fabric of space-time and concluded with Starfleet enacting a warp speed limit to help minimize the environmental damage. That's right, space speed bumps. If they wrote this today, you'd probably expect a congestion charge here, a toll road there a charge, everywhere a space charge. Anyway, the warp speed limit subplot certainly had potential to shake up the franchise's status quo, but the writer Brandon Braga rightly concluded that when you limit the warp drive, the rug is being pulled out from under the Star Trek, and well, thankfully, it was dropped. The warp speed limit was go on to be mentioned a few times in a few more episodes following Force of Nature, the Pegasus and Eye of the Beholder, both times in order to give the Enterprise D permission to exceed that limit. And then, well, never spoke about it again. Whilst behind the scenes material indicated that the variable geometry warp engines employed by the USS Voyager in Star Trek Voyager were intended to counteract the issues raised in Force of Nature. This was never spoken on screen and never accounted for in Star Trek Deep Space Nine or the TNG movies or anywhere ever again. To be fair, I'm pretty glad about that because a bit boring. Number 5, Basil's Federation membership. Deep Space Nine was the pinnacle of serialized Star Trek storytelling, with very few of its major threads or subplots going unresolved in the show's 7-season run. Whilst the show is famous for the Dominion War arc and to a lesser extent its handling of the Marquis, the primary focus of Deep Space Nine's first few seasons was Bajor and the Cisco missions to bring the Bajorans into the United Federation of Planets. This directive was clearly stated by Captain Picard in the first episode, Emissary, when he said to Cisco, "Do everything you can short of violating the Prime Directive to ensure Bajor would be ready to enter the Federation." This goal was nearly achieved too in the 5th season, but in Rapture, well, that's the name of that episode, the coming war with the Dominion manifested itself as a vision of Locus over Bajor, and Cisco persuaded the Council of Ministers to delay membership for the time being. Now, this issue was flirted with on and off a few times, but Bajor's independence became a major plot point by the end of Season 5 and early in Season 6. The Dominion War became Deep Space Nine's driving storyline by then, and its final 2 seasons and Bajor's Federation membership fell by the wayside. Number 4, the Borg Resistance. Following the introduction of 7 of 9 in Scorpion Part 2, battling the Borg became a major recurring storyline in Star Trek Voyager. while Captain Janeway and the rest of the crew found at least half a dozen new and action-packed ways to defeat their cybernetic foes, a major blow was dealt to the collective in the two-part episode Unimatrix Zero. In that episode, a cabal of virtually linked drones were freed and began a resistance movement. By the end of the 7th season premiere, members of Unimatrix Zero had a fleet of liberated Borg vessels at their disposal and were positioned to be a novel and exciting way for Star Trek Voyager to conclude its ongoing Borg storyline. But while Voyager went to encounter the Borg twice more, Unimatrix Zero and its XB freedom fighters were never heard from again. All the promise of bringing the Borg down from within was forgotten, and Captain Janeway was forced to come up with another way to momentarily defeat the Borg once and for all in Endgame, with no mention again of Unimatrix Zero. Number 3. The Klingon War. This one might actually be more accurately described as a main plot that went nowhere. When it premiered, Star Trek Discovery was about what happens when you put a do-gooding Starfleet scientist in the uncomfortable position of fighting a brutal war against a foe that, let's be honest, is fluent in its savagery. Indeed, much of the first half of Discovery's premiere season focused on getting the USS Discovery's spore drive up and running to give Starfleet the edge against the Klingons and win the war. The show swayed between telling us the Klingons were winning and telling us the Federation was winning the war, and then it shunted Disco off into the mirror universe for, well, half a season. And by the time the crew returned, the war was basically lost, as was all hope. The 2 episodes that quickly concluded the Klingon War were in reality added to the series, ordered by CBS, possibly indicating that the producers intended to continue the plot into Star Trek Discovery's 2nd season. With 2 additional episodes added to the schedule, the show found a quick way to wrap things up and move on to greener pastures with the Red Angel, and well, that was that. Number 2, son of Mo. We could have just said grandson of Mo, but I guess that doesn't really come off the tongue the same way, does it? Not to pick on Lieutenant Worf's personal life, but the truly recurring thread of Worf and his son Alexander's relationship was about as uninteresting to the writers as it was to the audience. Alexander Regenko cropped up in 8 episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation and 4 of Deep Space Nine, and neither show really found a compelling story for this poor kid. Alex's time on Star Trek The Next Generation was mostly spent with Worf's adoptive parents, and whilst his recast guest spots on Deep Space Nine were slightly more tolerable, the writers smushed Alexander's storyline and his character to make him look a bit bumbly and clumsy, which, for a Klingon, it ain't a good look. Before, he just kind of sort of disappeared again, and this time he disappeared for good. Number 1. The Temporal Cold War. Look, we all know how it works in sci-fi. If you really can't tie up a storyline, a little sprinkle of that time travel seasoning will help you get there. But not too much though, because too much seasoning will spoil the stew. Now, included in this series at the behest of United Paramount Network, aka UPN, the Temporal Cold War arc cropped up in 12 episodes throughout Star Trek Enterprise's first 3 seasons, before being abruptly concluded in the 4th season premiere Stormfront Part 2. Now, the decision was made by freshly installed showrunner Manny Coto, who stated he believed the Enterprise relied too heavily on time travel in the earlier seasons, and that everything that had been said about the Temporal Cold War had already been said. The final appearance of Silic and Daniels in Stormfront Part 2 was a resolution of sorts, with lip service being paid to the Temporal Cold War ending in that timeline and being repaired by Archer and the crew of the NX-01. But questions still remained, and more importantly, more stories remained. But the Temporal Cold War subplot fizzled before it even got hot, which is not necessarily a bad thing because, like I said, we don't want to over-season that Star Trek stew. There you go, 12 Star Trek subplots that went nowhere. What did we miss? Let us know in the comments below. For more awesome Star Trek content, make sure you hit like and subscribe. And also, don't forget to give us a follow on the old Twitter @TrekCulture. You can find me on social media as well, @Marcus Bronzy, MarcusBronzy. See you next time. Kapra!